Todos. Good morning to all. Estamos aqui, o Comitê Gestor da Internet.
Good morning, everyone. We are here. We are the Internet Management Committee and to talk about platform regulation. And today we are having our third panel. Today's panel will be addressing antitrust tools within the context of platform regulation. The group that we built in the Internet Management Committee for Platform Regulation started the work, or is starting, with this international cycle. But from now on, we are going to continue the discussion for Brazil, and we are going to do this on the second half of the year. So these four first panels that we are holding, and today we are having our fourth one, and in the afternoon we are going to have our last panel. This is the beginning of the process that we are developing within the Internet Management Committee to coordinate the multi-sector debate in Brazil within a national prospect and also for developing countries about this important issue that is being globally discussing, which is super relevant for the future. Today, our moderator is going to be Professor Olavo Chinaglia, and I am going to read his CV so that you know more about his work. He has a PhD in commercial law by the University of São Paulo. He has been working for more than 20 years with economic law in this antitrust area, has been a member of the CADE, the Brazilian Antitrust Agency. He's going to moderate the debate, and I hope the audience through the YouTube channels can interact and ask the questions. And at the end, when the two speakers end speaking, Professor Martín Becerra from Buenos Aires and Professor Hebert Hovenkamp from Pennsylvania University. And then Olavo is going to introduce our two speakers today. And I'm very grateful to Mr. Chinaglia for his participation with us. And then he's going to chair the Q&A session with questions from the audience. For those of you who are watching us, we are on YouTube. There are channels within the original audio. I'm speaking Portuguese, and then Martín is going to speak in Spanish, and Hovenkamp will be speaking in English as well as Chinaglia, and you can choose your language, Portuguese, English, or Spanish, or the original audio, and you're going to have a combination of the three languages. Now, I'm going to give the floor to Professor Chinaglia. Please, now, Professor, you're chairing the panel.
Good morning, everyone.
Thank you very much, Henrique.
Brazilian Internet Steering Committee for inviting me to moderate this session. It's a true privilege for me to mediate the discussions among these two distinguished professors, Mr. Martín Becerra, who is a principal researcher at CONICET and a tenured professor at the National University of Quilmes and University of Buenos Aires. He is a doctor in information science from the Autonomous University of Barcelona and directs the research program Cultural Industries, Media and Communication Policies in Convergence in Argentina of the UNQ and projects financed by the Ministry of Science, Technology and Productive Innovation. He has consulted for UNESCO, Amnesty International, CELS, and other organizations. Professor Hebert Hovenkamp is the James D. Deanan University Professor, Penn Law and the Wharton School, University of Pennsylvania. He's a fellow of the American Academy of Arts and Science, and in 2008 received the Justice Department's John Sherman Award for lifetime contributions to antitrust law. His principal antitrust scholarships includes antitrust law with the late Philip Arida and the late Donald Turner, and federal antitrust policy, the law of competition and its practice. His legal history writing includes the opening of American law, enterprise and American law. So the scope of this session is to discuss the tools offered by antitrust law for the purpose of regulating media and platforms. We're going to discuss what would be such objectives and what would be the limitations of antitrust in pursuing such goals. Just to put these discussions in the context, antitrust law has grounds not only in economy, but also, of course, in law science, in philosophy, and politics. The economic ground for antitrust is well known. Antitrust is a tool for intervention of the state in the economic domain, and it aims at fulfilling market loopholes and breaches. From the legal standpoint, the grounds for antitrust are, in most of the jurisdictions, consolidated in the federal constitutions, and Brazil would not be an exception to this. We have an entire section in our constitution describing the scopes of what we call the economic order. Essentially, the tools and the limits for intervention of the state in the economy, as I just mentioned. When it comes to philosophy, I understand antitrust as the transposition to the economic domain of the philosophy of the French Revolution. We could understand that the liberty of an economic agent ceases when the freedom of or the liberty of another economic agent would begin. And finally, from the standpoint of politics, antitrust is an instrument for the state to impose limitations to economic power and avoid that it fully transforms into political power. In this context, discussing whether or not antitrust offers good tools to limitate or to determine the role of platforms is absolutely consistent with its ground, its philosophical ground, its political ground, not to mention, of course, the economic and legal grounds. So we're going to start with Professor Martín Becerra. We'll have around 20 minutes to make his initial remarks. Then Professor Hovenkamp will follow with his own remarks on this subject, and we'll then open the floor for questions from the audience. Thank you. Thank you, Professor Martín. Thank you, Professor Hovenkamp.
Thank you, Olavo. Muito obrigado por las organizadores.
Well, thank you very much for your words. I'm going to
Thank you very much, organizers. I'll be speaking in Spanish.
I am going to speak slowly. And we do have simultaneous translation here. I believe that this is a very important matter. In addition to thanking the organizers, I regret that Dina Shiriban won't be able to participate in this conference because it would have been very interesting to see her point of view. Now, I'm going to share my screen. I believe that all of you can see my screen. Part of my talk is based on a study that I carried out with Guillermo Mastrini for UNESCO that has been published like a year and a half ago. This is media, telecommunication, and internet, and the perspective of the competition. That is the title. So I believe that the agenda of the antitrust agenda, authorities in all the world all analyze this theme. And my first provocation here would be to answer the question that is that we have to overcome the limits and we have to make progress and create possibilities, focusing on the competition that is very narrow, to think about the antitrust perspectives in the frameworks of the internet platforms. In the study that I mentioned together with Mastrini, we interviewed over 10 competition authorities from 10 different Latin American countries, and the answers to the questions, if they should do something regarding the dominance of these platforms when it comes to manage personal data. 2 years ago, they said that this was negative. I'm absolutely sure that today, if we would ask the same, authorities would give us a different result. Here we had great scandals regarding the abuse of content, of personal data, also accounts of presidents like Jair Bolsonaro or Donald Trump as well, or Maduro president. We have documentation of unloyal competition in the wholesale and retail advertisement that damages the users. And in 2021, the competition authorities review what the internet platforms do. Now, the challenge of the regulators, both of the media and of personal data, of telecommunication, is to incorporate the methods and concepts of the competition because of the technological convergence, of the technological disruption in the sector of telecommunication. And the challenge for these antitrust authorities is to understand the specificities of the resources of information, communication, and culture, and the difference that we have between data and information. I believe that we have divided statements. We have the antitrust policies with different points of view, but on the other side, we have the democratic theory that is based on diversity and the plurality of voices. So it is related to the competition in the public arena. They're open to free competition in order to participate in this public debate. And we also have the family that wants to protect personal data and privacy. If we see it this way, by and large, the different states and the supra-state agencies like the European Commission have legal regulations that are differentiated. One is for the competition, one is for freedom of speech and content, and the other one would be for privacy and personal data. Now these three families today, they are united in one main object that are the platform, the communication specificity, sees the access to culture, privacy, protection of personal data, non-discrimination, freedom of speech. These things could be damaged because of the type of competition that may exist in the framework of the convergency of communication and excessive concentration. Olavo mentioned this. In the network changes, all the productive change of the media, of telecommunication, internet, and therefore the good practices have to consider specificities and to harmonize the principles of competition, protection of personal data, and to also encourage a public debate and also freedom of speech. We have antitrust traditions since the Sherman Law from 1990 or 1914, where there is a strong tradition, especially in the United States, that has illuminated the legal regulatory tradition that has been incorporated by the different countries throughout the 20th century. In Latin America, this took place later, as of the 90s, the last decade of the 20th century, when Brazil, Argentina, Colombia, and other Latin American countries, they adopted antitrust laws inspired in a law that in the telecommunications sector were highly known. Like, for example, the case of CBS of 1970, AT&T in the 80s, also the case that was the civil and commercial use of the internet. Microsoft shows this tradition, but this is a tradition that was interrupted from the famous work of Robert Bork of the antitrust paradox that obviously introduces another type of perspective that weakens the reach of the competition, especially in the area of communications. Now, the tradition of the United States is different from the European one, as we know, where in Europe, number one, the sectorial authorities analyze abuse, or they diagnose a situation. For example, in terms of media, they talk about pluralism, diversity, and freedom of speech, and they talk about personal data and also competition defense in order to sanction distortions to the competition in the market. In the United States, this is done by the judicial power. In addition to this, in Europe, the concern on diversity and pluralism isn't only the entry barriers for a competition. In the United States, it's less common to analyze these entry barriers and more common to see how the end users are affected in terms of services and prices. This, in my opinion, it is a narrow point of view that contemplates the impact on the prices to the consumer in a certain market with a limit consideration on what is the relevant market, and all the specialized people know that this is a central point, and I would say that this is a political point as well. Well, today the competition authorities, they apply their criteria that I believe are not effective and they don't clearly work, like with the acquisition of WhatsApp by Facebook, when Google bought YouTube, and there is a lack of intervention to create policies that are very complicated to revert.
So it is very important to establish antitrust practices. And of course, we are subject to what politics dictate over us. And of course, it is important to have companies, but would that ever exist without competitors? In digital markets, for example, in the network, it is very difficult to find a real competence in each or every segment that we analyze in this digital economy. On the other hand, and of course, Linacan has documented in a wide encompassing study, said that small competence may reduce competence, including the number of consumers. So this, there was on the past week a sentence from one of the prosecutors with regards to Amazon and regarding to 50 or 70% of sales on e-commerce has leveraged or increase the price to consumers, the final consumers. So this has affected all the previous controls and previous stages that we had for this type of trust. So, and of course, this is increasingly affecting us, considering the principles of competence, and of course, from the point of view of the authorities. And of course, the market has been concentrated in a few hands, and this had not been considered. As we mentioned before, we have to consider what is relevant in the context of convergence of information of this type of market, the information market. So what is the relevance of this market? Is it sports? Is it relevant information content? So what kind of market are we talking about? Are we talking about wholesale market? Are we talking about digital market? Is it a labor market? Is it a sector that is linking streaming or audio visual material? So extraction, storage of information and data. So all of that should be included. Of course, competence and authorities, either in Brazil, Mexico, Colombia. So they have somehow intervened, at least in Latin America, and then they have been, I would say, kind of partial in some cases. They have tried to understand and examine the entire sphere and universe, considering all the bullet points of this industry. So the idea of having a relevant market, the .com market, and of course the problems related to the network effect. So as a Swedish group called the winner takes all, so which takes us back to that song by ABBA, this Swedish band. So that somehow gives evidence to the fact that there are barriers to the entry to the market, and of course this lack of symmetry are not corrected. So far, they haven't been corrected through the intervention that we have had so far by the competent authorities. I would like to quote an article that was published in The Economist and says that the competence is actually considering three great or major problems. Lack of curiosity. As a matter of fact, they are not linking how much they make, and then of course the capital increase and the decrease on the number of participants and the competition. So that is, in other words, like a meteorological effect, something that is happening because of its nature without having a relationship between themselves or among themselves. So it is politics and economy, and they are not related to. And the second problem mentioned in this article, in this feature, and The Economist, is lack of clarity, lack of openness. So, of course, certain thing that it is good for the consumer is good for the market. So when this is considered like this, just considering price to the final consumer, final user, and also with a focus on the, in quotes, well-being of a consumer, so consumers can be subject to a drop of prices in the market. Of course, they can suffer that too. And in many of the current markets, there's no price. The price is what? How much we pay in terms of data, personal data that we provide to be part of some sort of network. So we as users have to provide certain personal data to get a better experience, as we say, in this convergent market. And the third thing is that the organizers of this competence have somehow been trapped by the most important actors in the market. So there is like a rolling door, a swinging door of this private sector. just to close up what I want to say, my message is that I would like to propose certain challenges, perhaps some opportunities of changes that we can notice or we've seen happen in the last few months with regards to the competence, based on the evidences that we've witnessed at the last 5-6 years in this industry of the digital economy. So communication, it is a very important asset for the democracy, and it cannot be totally captured and by neoclassical criteria. And the second thing, the need for agencies, both sectorial and competing agencies and regulators, they have to consider the perspective of antitrust policies, principally with regards to the communication, to understand that competence can be analyzed and promoted with the same instruments to all markets, either steel market, automotive market, so any sector, be it personal data, communication, telecommunications market, so any of the markets. And the third thing is that authorities have to implement the resources, intellectual resources, capabilities, so that all the those who are involved are familiarized and are aware of the theme with regards to the right of access to culture, freedom of expression, pluralism, and so on and so forth. So it is important that the authorities and regulating agencies and and antitrust organizations can play their part. So it is difficult to correct this lack of symmetry, and of course the promises vowed by Senator Warren. That was a promise that could be eluding many, but it is very difficult to accomplish those or to meet those promises made the way they were made. So it is important to advocate for the competence in this sector to complement our performance, and then this has to be binding. So this has to be some sort of work that meets its goals in our antitrust policies. Likewise, convergence of communication has to consider what it is relevant in a market. In Argentina, for example, in our previous government, the competence authority depends on the executive power, and it is not independent. In our previous government, Macri, he authorized the great openness, and it was a merge between telecom and television. It was a major merge in the country. And in our commission for the advocacy of competence in the market, considered what is relevant in our country. But of course, this should be considered as well. On the other hand, in the social media, we don't have to link that by price to measure the consumer satisfaction. So it is important to find replacement for services that are available. For example, the more people take part of a certain service, we mentioned, and some of the anti-competitive practices that are being done by Google. So it is not available to all users, consumers, and for example, WhatsApp is rating 0 in Latin America. That means that Facebook has no equally has not a very good service to peer to their services. So it is relevant, and there is an impact on the messaging service in Latin America. I would like to close by saying the following. And there are some other recommendations that I would like to quote here, but I understand that we are short of time. So I believe that the global and regional expansion of the communication market require other things that are important to emphasize integration, the efforts to unite our approach through the world. And of course, it is important to consider services that are registered in one country, but it has no representation in other countries. So they pay taxes in one country and they operate in other countries. So this should be also part of our agenda to regulate and stimulate competence in this sector. And so far, we haven't had much of that. Thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you very much, Professor Becerra. It was a very interesting presentation. And I think that when we open the floor for debates, you'll be able to complete your suggestions. All right? Well, now I'll open the floor to Mr. Professor Hebert Hovenkamp. Please, Professor.
Thank you very much. I really appreciate the invitation. Thank you to the authority for having me. I look very much forward to this conference, and thank you to Professor Becerra for his remarks. I'm going to give you mainly the U.S. antitrust perspective, a little bit about what is going on in the U.S. with respect to the large digital platforms in light of what I think to be the proper set of goals for antitrust. And in order to do that, I'm going to share my screen as well. So here it comes. Okay, I hope you can see it now. The goals of the antitrust laws in the United States are somewhat in dispute, but I'm going to suggest a goal that I think is both defensible and practical, not necessarily easy. And that is that the goal of the antitrust laws should be to further maximum output in the markets to which it applies, consistent with sustainable competition. That goal favors consumers who are best off as output is maximized because it brings low prices, brings a high degree of information, better product quality, and the like. It also benefits labor, which is benefited by large output that creates job opportunities. It benefits many input suppliers, although there the story is a little bit more complicated, and I'll try to get back to that a little later on. I would reject such alternative goals as the competitive process, which is articulated by some of my American friends. I don't think it really means anything, and it doesn't provide any measurable criteria for assessing an antitrust policy. It's also been used widely by both the far right and the far left. Indeed, if you look through the case law, it's the conservatives who have used the term competitive process more than liberals, but liberals are starting to pick it up as well today. But my objection is mainly that that term can mean pretty much anything that you want it to mean. And then I think we need to avoid two extremes. One is the idea that the platforms are doing just great and everything is just perfectly fine. But the other one is that the platforms are inherently monopolistic, and the only way we can really deal with these problems is to break them up. I see the relationship between antitrust law and the two extremes as an inverted U. The goal of the antitrust laws is high output, as measured by the vertical axis on this picture. The problem with both the neoliberal under-enforcement position and the neo-Brandeisian excessive enforcement position is that they both favor reduced output, but for different reasons. Under-enforcement produces high profits, as a result, less demand and lower output. Over-enforcement often leads to the lack of very important efficiencies. And so my own view is that we should favor an antitrust policy somewhere in the middle. In keeping that in mind, I think we have to remember a couple of things. The platforms have, in fact, been significant engines of economic growth. We talked today about the internet economy, and the large digital platforms have made their contribution to that. And we always need to keep that in mind. On the other hand, their history with smaller firms is complex, and as I will get to in a little bit, they are probably guilty as well of many anti-competitive practices. Historically, they are not yet shown to be more durable than the other traditional monopolies in United States markets, like U.S. Steel, IBM, Xerox. As recently as 10 or 15 years ago, writers were speaking about MySpace, the predecessor to Facebook, as if it were a permanent natural monopoly. And of course, it was displaced by Facebook. If they're not natural monopolies, then they require exclusionary practices in order to survive. So I think, one of the things, in my view, is that we need to identify exclusionary practices and not break them up simply because they are very big firms. Another thing to keep in mind is that they are probably not winner-take-all markets to the extent that product differentiation is available, and in most cases it is. So for example, just to take Facebook as an example, is Facebook a winner-take-all market? Well, if the question is, could you enter the market with a clone, with something that looked exactly like Facebook looks? I think the answer is clearly no. Network effects are much too substantial. Facebook has far too big a head start, so a lookalike is not going to be able to enter that market. On the other hand, a differentiated entrant can enter the market, and we have examples of that. Twitter, which has become very successful, TikTok, which is emergent and younger, but is also has also proven to be quite successful. And I think there will be other differentiated entrants. So the key to entry in many of these internet markets is through product differentiation. And indeed, the Federal Trade Commission acknowledges that in its Facebook complaint, and its antitrust complaint against Facebook, that the new entrants are likely to be product differentiated firms. I think this approach also explains why Google Search has been a relatively successful dominant firm. It continues to have market shares above 90%. It certainly does engage in a certain number of potentially exclusionary practices, including large payments to Apple to be the default search engine. But one of the problems with search engines is that differentiation has proven to be more difficult than it has been with something like Facebook or other Google products or Amazon, which are much more susceptible to innovation. On the question of market power, there's a vast economic and legal literature on how you measure market power, how much market power is necessary. One clear source of market power is, of course, network effects. That is to say, as networks get larger, their value increases, and as a result, a smaller competitive network would be at a disadvantage. But once again, here there are a couple of offsetting things. One is multi-homing, Many network industries are subject to multi-homing, which means customers can access two or more different services and switch among them at fairly low cost and fairly quickly. And the other one is product differentiation. Once again, there are many two-sided platforms that are much more competitively structured. Those include magazines, newspapers, dating sites. You think about a dating site, right? You want on a dating site, normally you would think that if this is a traditional dating site with men looking for women, that you'd want a dating site with the largest number of women. Women would want a dating site with the largest number of men. So why is it we don't have one single dating site that covers everybody? And the answer is that dating sites are in fact very differentiated from one another. They appeal to various groups by ethnicity, by politics, by preferences for food, pets, sexual practices, and so on. And as long as those things are true and different dating sites can appeal to them, we will probably continue to have competition in the dating site market. On market definition, if some of you have been following it, we've had this lengthy trial now between Epic Games and Apple, and one of the principal issues in that case was market definition. Epic Games would like to have a market definition limited to the Apple iPhone platform. And of course, if that is the market definition, then Apple would have a 100% market share. Apple, on the other hand, looks at the fact that Epic Games can be used on the iPhone, on Android phones, on both of the major game consoles, PlayStation and Xbox, and also on traditional laptops and desktops. And indeed, if you aggregate all of the platforms on which Epic Games can be played and installed, Apple's market share drops to something like 10%. So as we are talking, the judge is considering how the market definition ought to play out in the Epic Games case. I think we need to think much more about the use of cluster markets in dealing with the platforms, particularly for products such as Facebook and Amazon, perhaps Google. A cluster market, markets normally consist of close substitutes, but the feature of a cluster market is that it groups together services or products that are literally not in competition with each other for purposes of analysis. Generally, it does that when there are economies of joint provision. It's cheaper to offer multiple things together than to offer one, or users prefer to have multiple products or services on the same platform. So this will be an issue in the Facebook litigation that the Federal Trade Commission filed late in 2020. The motion to dismiss in that case alleges that the market that the Federal Trade Commission alleges is incoherent because it groups together all of these various non-competing services that Facebook offers. And I think one of the questions will be whether the act of clustering multiple services together serves to create a cost reduction or a competitive advantage that justifies the use of of a market that includes non-competing products. I think one of the great tragedies in U.S. antitrust law right now is that the U.S. Supreme Court has been hostile toward direct measures of market power, econometric measures of market power, which the Supreme Court rejected in the American Express case for vertical practices. And of course, most of the practices we're talking about with respect to the platforms are vertical. It's not to say that residual demand is easy to measure. presents some significant difficulties in zero price markets. But nevertheless, it is possible. It's the preferred mechanism for measuring power among many economists. It's very data intensive, but one feature of platform markets is that their transactions are digitized, so the data are usually within reach. For example, I believe direct measurement of market power would be useful in the Epic Games case because they're not zero price markets. They're markets in which Apple is obtaining royalties, and as a result, econometric measures of demand responses to price changes at given margins would be quite easy. However, I believe the case is going up under the assumption that under the American Express rule, market power is going to have to be addressed in terms of a relevant market. Of course, market power requires an entry barrier. And here, I think one of the biggest single problems with respect to the large digital platforms is their ongoing repeated acquisitions of small, nascent startup firms. They have acquired them in the hundreds, and pretty much everybody knows what's going on. They're trying to prevent competition by buying up startups as soon as they come into existence in order to keep a competitor from emerging. And indeed, in the Facebook complaint by the FTC quotes some documents and emails from Facebook with respect to the acquisition of Instagram, suggesting that Facebook acquired Instagram in order to exclude it from the market as an independent entrant. So if there's one thing to do that I think would further competition in the platform market without limiting technological growth, I believe it would be to have a much harsher rule governing internet mergers in which the acquiring firm is a large internet platform. In terms of anti-competitive conduct, I don't think we should be going after the platforms simply because they are very large. We do not have a law of no-fault monopoly in the United States, and I don't agree with those people that believe we should have. On the other hand, I think there are plenty of anti-competitive practices to go after. One is a set of practices that I would characterize roughly as quasi-exclusive dealing, but all kinds of preferential agreements that now Amazon, once again in a recent case brought by the Attorney General of Washington, D.C. against Amazon. Google has similar restrictions on advertising, as does Facebook, and as does Apple. Refusal to deal has reemerged as an antitrust issue, at least at the academic discussion level. The courts have been hostile, led by the Supreme Court. But one of the very interesting things about the Epic Games case last week is the judges repeated asking of questions about the relevance of major unilateral refusal to deal cases in the United States, including Aspen skiing, which found a refusal to deal unlawful. The Terminal Railroad case, more than 100 years old, which condemned an unlawful refusal, and then also Trinco, which refused to condemn it. And a fair belief that today's Supreme Court would be antagonistic to the development of any expansion of the law of unilateral refusal to deal. However, it is one of the principal complaints that Epic Games made against Apple, and Apple has already filed a special motion to dismiss on that one count of the complaint that alleges that the Apple platform is an essential facility, and as a result, Apple has a duty to share it. I think a more promising line of litigation involves most favored nation, or MFN clauses. The case brought against Apple just this week, against Amazon just this week. Also cases that have involved Google, Facebook with advertising, and so on. These are situations that involve contracts in which the dominant firm insists on getting a better deal from some supplier than other firms get. So, for example, Amazon, it is alleged, deals in products supplied by third parties and has in its contracts with these suppliers requirements that they will not sell to competing platforms who sell them at a lower price than Amazon. In the presence of power, those could very easily be subject to condemnation, although I think the better remedy for such conduct is an injunction against the conduct and not a breakup of the firm. And finally, use of defaults, which comes up quite frequently with respect to Google, although it's also relevant with respect to Apple. Google pays Apple a very large sum of money, $7 or $8 billion a year, it is reported, to make Google search the default search engine on Apple. And that is being challenged as anti-competitive. There may be a link between the very large payment that Google pays to Apple and Google Search's very large market share. And in addition to that, Google's licensing restrictions with respect to Android phones and the Google Play Store also require, as a practical matter, at least in the US, that Google Search be the default search engine. So, critics of Google Search say that the reason Google Search has the 90% market share that it has is these payments plus some other exclusionary contracts. Google Search is more likely to say it's a couple of things. One is that it's the biggest because it's the best and more consumer-friendly search engine. And the other one is that it is, in fact, a natural monopoly. And it is the best search engine because it has a very large installed base of both customers and information. One of the problems in U.S. law is that our current law of tying arrangements does not reach defaults. That is to say, a default is not a true tie. For example, in the Apple case, when Apple makes Google Search the default search engine on the iPhone, it's not a true tie because although it's the default search engine, any customer who wishes can substitute a different search engine or multi-home on search engines, which means you can install multiple search engines on your iPhone. I have an iPhone. I have 5 or 6 search engines that I use. And current American law with respect to tying requires that the products be tied, and a simple default, that is a simple preference for one over something else, does not constitute a tie. And then finally, a little bit on effective remedies. Here's where I caution a little bit of a conservative approach. As I said earlier, the platforms are major contributors to economic growth. We have a very large interest group in the United States, kind of at the progressive or leftish end of our antitrust, who are very strong about breaking up the platforms. I think you need to be very, very careful before you break up platforms insofar as we're talking about internally developed assets. Now, I would distinguish acquired assets, and indeed the Federal Trade Commission's complaint against Google cites 2 of those acquired assets. One is Instagram, and one is WhatsApp. They were acquired 8 or 10 years ago. They have not been fully integrated into the Facebook platform. And I think that the breaking up or the reversing of anti-competitive mergers is a viable and valuable antitrust remedy. However, if we're talking about things that are internally developed, we may end up paying a very high price in terms of consumer satisfaction and efficiency if we simply start to break things up. Another remedy that has been proposed is line of business restrictions governing mainly Amazon. One of the proposals is that Amazon be segregated from its third-party sellers. So in other words, Amazon could put its own internally produced products like Amazon Basics products on one website, but it would have to put all of the products sold by third-party merchants on a different website. I also think that's a very bad idea. And the main reason for that is that the presence of both Amazon products and third-party products on the same website furthers competition and produces lower prices in many, many cases. For example, I'll give you one example. Amazon sells its own batteries under the Amazon Basics brand. I'm talking about just ordinary household batteries like AAA batteries or 9-volt batteries. It sells those under the Amazon Basics brand. It also sells brands such as Duracell. And if you do a search for batteries, you'll find both of them right next to each other. And that kind of competition, the Amazon Basics batteries are usually cheaper than the brand name batteries. That kind of competition forces the price of the brand names down. And indeed, it's no different in principle than the widespread practice in physical stores, which is now a half century old, of using house brands in competition with highly advertised name brands. You give the consumer the option of lower prices, and segregating the platforms makes that competition much more difficult. So I would not be in favor of those types of restrictions. I do believe that a promising set of restrictions is compelled interoperability, which enlarges the range of network effects across more firms, and as a result can improve rather than diminish consumer satisfaction. And here, of course, the principal model for such a breakup is in the United States is the telephone system, AT&T, where the telephone system was in fact broken up both horizontally and vertically into 7 baby bells. It was segregated from its instruments and segregated from its then existing long distance services. However, under the supervision of the court initially, and then later on by statute, interoperability was compelled across the entire system. And as a result, there was room for smaller players. Nobody wants to run a telephone system that cannot interconnect. And so with interoperability, you can get many of the advantages of a large network and further competition inside the network. And so then let me just conclude by saying that we should not underestimate the utility and value of properly designed injunctions. Injunctions are considered by some people to be dull and old-fashioned. Well, we've been giving injunctions for centuries, but the fact is that a properly tailored injunction can bring to an end many of these anti-competitive practices, and that, coupled with harsher treatment of anti-competitive mergers, I think, would go a long way to making the platforms more competitive without doing things that are potentially highly destructive, such as breaking them up. Okay, I think I've used up my time. Thank you very much. I appreciate that, and I will release my screen.
Thank you very much, Professor Hovenkamp. It was likewise Martín Becerra's presentation was a very intriguing and provocative set of remarks. And well, I'd like to apologize to both of you, the panelists, for the unsympathetic messages alerting that we were reaching our time. But I was eager to open the floor to the audience questions. And I will allow myself to start with a general remark inspired by some comments I received, and particularly Mr. Ademir Monteiro has mentioned the lack of ability of antitrust enforcers worldwide to regulate both the traditional economy, meaning let's say the offline sectors of economy, and what would be even worse, an aggravated problem when it comes to online business models, which are new to all of them. I would have two thoughts on this, or inspired on this. First, and this would connect to Mr. Becerra's presentation, there is indeed a point of contact between the traditional media and the new media platforms. Business models that are at the very bottom based on revenues originated from advertising. Open TV and any other media, newspapers, magazines, and the online platforms as well, they take advantage of the fact that they reach a huge amount of people, and then they can bring advertising messages to those individuals. And Mr. Hovenkamp has called our attention to the fact that online platforms is, let's say, a gender that would allow many different species. We have platforms that aim at specific niches of the consumer's market, and platforms with completely different purposes. So what would be the common point among all these platforms, and that could be, let's say, the leading direction for antitrust enforcers worldwide to develop antitrust, or to apply antitrust tools in a more effective way? And I would like to listen to your thoughts on this. What is the main competitive driver among platforms? Is the ability to read the customers or the consumer's behavior, to anticipate the consumer's behavior, so that the advertising can be directed and then becomes more effective. So what all the platforms would have in common is the strategy, or they need to have some strategy to gather information about the consumer's preferences. I was thinking about the Google situation. We normally think of Google as a very dominant, a super dominant firm that would be, let's say, hardly face any competition. But if we look from the historical perspective, Google was not the first search engine. We had, before Google, for instance, we had Yahoo. And what makes Google so different from the other search engines, my opinion, is the fact that Google incorporated other strategies of gathering information about people's or consumers' preferences. Google Earth and the acquisition of YouTube, all of these initiatives were part of the same strategy of developing ways and tools to anticipate, to predict what would be the behavior of the customers. So at the end of the day, should the competition enforcers worldwide try to learn how to read or interpret the consumer's behavior in order to maybe come up with different antitrust policies to address this kind of business that we are discussing here? Or would it be utopic to think that we would have one solution to fit all the problems? After I hear your thoughts, then I would have a new or another question. It comes from Mrs. Alice Maria Costa. She's actually mentioning that the role of antitrust could, or at least should, incorporate concerns with data privacy and could serve to the individuals as a tool to restrain access to their own personal information. Do you think that this is feasible? And if so, what would be the actual measures to be taken in order to allow antitrust to perform this role? And I will allow anyone among the professors to share the thoughts. I don't.
Please, Professor Hebert, if you want to begin.
Professor Becerra, why don't you go first, and I'll say something.
Okay. So let me say that. Sorry, I will speak in Spanish because I am more confident in Spanish. Sorry. Voy a juntar ambas preguntas.
Let me just combine both questions, your intervention and the question that's being proposed. So as a matter of fact, yes, it is utopia. It is, of course, interesting to propose that. Let us think on this following situation. If there is no combination or a perspective that unites competence and personal data, if there is no mingling, there won't be any competence in our digital market. I am absolutely in accordance with your presentation and your point of view, Professor Hebert Hovenkamp. And as a matter of fact, I consider the storage of information, actually the collection of all this data, personal data that we collect today, and actually this is in the hands of major platforms. If the authorities and data information, personal information, so if they don't find a way to get that, for that to be accessible, I don't know what way. So, but if that can be found by or used by competitors, there won't be any competence. As a matter of fact, Google search, this engine, it is not the best, but it is, as a matter of fact, the only one that we have because of the volume of data they have storage, they have assembled in more than 2 decades. This is why they're so large. So as a matter of fact, it was not the first, that's correct, but it was the first one that really identified several aspects, principally, for example, of the platforms, it identifies that quite well. So that was the first one that managed to identify and treat personal data, as a matter of fact, personalized, customized search in their driver for the development of their engine. So as a matter of fact, this is the one that all platforms use, and it is actually something that unites. As a matter of fact, they are very good. We have to mention that. So we either renounce this principle of competence, or we try to find what way we can. It would be more like a philosophical question. Who whose these personal data belong to. So what is the sovereignty we're talking about? So as a matter of fact, major corporations and those internet platforms, do they have that, or is there any other sort of geography? And what about the legal instruments, the legal tools that we have that play a part? So there are elements that help us question the sovereignty of that information. So of course, we have to have a better or perhaps a wider understanding from the personal data protection agencies on one side and also the other agencies. So it is, of course, an utopia. We're talking about utopia here. So, but then the result of the development of those platforms, we are talking about making headway towards utopia, because anything that we propose today, so interoperability, for example, and telecommunication industry, as a matter of fact, they started having in the beginning of the 20th century, and there was interoperability. This is what we were talking about 200 years ago. So it would be positive to us to propose, at least in our platform markets, something like more like a utopia. As Dorsey, the Twitter founder, he said that, well, with Twitter, we're going to reach this and that level of interoperability. Anyhow, that principle, the one of interoperability, supposes what? We are to treat the personal data to break up this logics of storaging corporate data and personal data. So for us, just to close what my thought, and also trying to answer what has been said before. So is there any silver bullet that we can have in our revolver to solve all this problems? I don't believe so. So as a matter of fact, a cluster or a group of measures that we have to really make, and it is in the whole thing together.
Very good, Professor Becerra. What about your thoughts, Professor Hovenkamp?
Thank you. Yes, thank you for those comments too. On the first part of the question, my advice is to go slow. Two-sided markets and digital platforms have not been around for a long time. It took a century of economic analysis for us to acquire mature understandings of traditional markets. I hope it doesn't take that long with two-sided markets, but it probably takes longer than we have, and we still do not have a good consensus over how market power is measured, how it's relevant, what the consequences of various types of intervention are. And that is why, from my perspective, injunctions are usually safer remedies than structural remedies. Structural remedies can be very damaging, particularly if they break up challenged, established lines of communication or sharing, or take off productive efficiencies. Injunctions are usually less intrusive. The United States went through this with respect to the Microsoft case, where the initial proposals the government made were to break Microsoft up, and the DC Circuit ended up coming up with a set of much more modest remedies that governed Microsoft's conduct. On the second part of the question, having to do with information, yes, information is relevant to antitrust policy in several ways. Particularly, one area that's generally not involved here is sharing, where the challenges to collusion. So, restrictive sharing of information between, say, two parties that refuse to share it with others, that could give rise to a fear of collusion. Information can also create threats of exclusion, and those are legitimate antitrust concerns. One of the difficulties we face today in the U.S., and we face it from both the left and the right, is the mixture of other concerns that I don't think fit into antitrust policy very I think I think Europeans in particular are right to put privacy more in control of consumers. But privacy is ultimately not a competition issue. It's an issue about human rights and individual priorities. And the other one is ideology. And here, what we're seeing and that I find very disturbing is a lot of attacks on the big digital platforms, but particularly Facebook, for coming up with policies that exclude certain people because of their ideology. I think that's an issue. I think it's an issue that needs to be addressed. I don't think the antitrust laws are a very good way of addressing it. Thank you.
Thank you, Professor Hovenkamp. So I might identify what seems to be a difference of opinion among our panelists with respect to one specific question. And I'd like to once again hear both of them, whether or not this perception is correct, and if it is or if it's not, whether there is indeed a problem. Mr. Becerra seems to understand that there's a substantive lack of competition among platforms. We need to create mechanisms for the main asset, which would be the information about the customer's preferences, should be somehow made available to other platforms, new entrants that would be then able to compete. I think that Mr. Becerra mentioned that there can be no competition if information is entirely controlled by these private entities. Mr. Hovenkamp, on the other hand, seems to understand, please correct me if I'm wrong, that competition is still possible from the perspective of antitrust, regardless of any consideration on who controls the information. There seems to be an understanding that it's possible to develop new ways to gather information, mainly because, or among other reasons, because information is not an asset that can be consumed. The customer's preferences will remain as the customer's preferences, regardless of whether or not someone has identified it, and regardless or not a company has addressed the preferences with directed advertisement. So, is there indeed this difference of opinions among you? And at the end of the day, we are discussing whether or not antitrust is an end in itself, or do we recognize antitrust as an instrument to pursue broader objectives?
Bueno, por mi parte sí, creo que es correcta la caracterización que ha hecho Olavo.
Well, as a matter of fact, yes, because I believe that the control of information and the monopoly, virtually the monopoly information of each sector in different markets, this is an obstacle. And of course, this is something that it is difficult to overcome by competence. And of course, anticipate practices and behavior from users. That is actually as an asset itself. And this, the control over this information may be something that it is irreplaceable, and it is unreplaceable. This is an extremely important asset for the success of a company.
And this is connected to something that was approached today that is buying startups, small, innovative companies. So the effect, this acquisition of innovative companies that create obstacles to an innovative dynamic in the market is facilitated by information control from one company in a certain segment, like search engine in the internet. Therefore, this is transformed, and there are many colleagues that have studied this subject. This turns into an anti-innovative and anti-competitive tool. So this ends up being a competition problem in addition of being a democratic problem. When companies concentrate so much public data and information, this is a competition problem because then competitors can't emerge and you don't have a real competition because nobody can predict the behavior of users and consumers in a market like the company has, this company that has this major position.
Professor Hovenkamp?
Professor Hovenkamp?
Yes, thank you. I don't disagree with that. My point was that information was not that information cannot be used anti-competitively, because I believe it can be. It was that in the US, there's a tendency to confuse ideological uses of information or ideological suppression of information, which I believe is an issue, but not an antitrust issue, and then considerations of privacy, where information can become exclusionary. Then I think some kind of remedy under the antitrust laws is appropriate. I would simply say that given what we know about network effects today, interoperability remedies are likely to be much more successful than structural breakup remedies. That is to say, if we really believe that Google search has its dominance because of its very large database of information, then I believe the solution to that problem is to make the database more accessible by rival search engines so that they can use it. And then the search engines can compete in other ways. They can compete for advertising, for example, on the basis of rates, but not on the basis of their information database. I also don't think that every problem of the large digital platforms is necessarily an informational problem. I mean, the fact is there are a lot of exclusionary contracts in the large platforms. And I think the first and most direct line of enforcement is to get injunctions against those practices. Thank you.
Wonderful. Well, we have a few more minutes that I would like to offer to both of you, Professor Becerra and Professor Hovenkamp, for some final thoughts, some final remarks before our host, Henrique Hebert, can wrap up our panel. Well, please, Professor Hovenkamp.
Yes, so, okay, I was kind of waiting to see. Yeah, I think it's important to have some historical perspective when you start looking at the platforms. I think we are inclined to jump to very quick conclusions. And the fact is, we don't know enough about the platforms in order to be highly confident in our remedies. I'm also somewhat apprehensive about more aggressive regulation because at least in the US, the history of regulation has not been very favorable. It has tended to suppress innovation. And I think the one thing that always needs to be lurking in in our mind when we are dealing with the platforms is that they are, in fact, highly innovative firms. They have generated a great deal of idea power in the world in the last several decades, and I don't think we want to get rid of that. So we have to take some pain to segregate the harmful effects from the beneficial ones, and then we have to tailor remedies in ways that suppress the harmful effects while preserving, to the extent possible, the beneficial effects. And that's why, like I said earlier, I think injunctions against proven anti-competitive practices, most of which are contract terms, by the way, injunctions are probably a promising first step rather than some more aggressive remedy that would involve breaking up these assets.
Thank you, Professor Hovenkamp. Professor Becerra.
Por mi parte quisiera finalizar señalando.
I would like to point out that a coincidence is that the type of establishment of these markets when the recent times and the effects, the behaviors, that is something very recent. Allows us to be cautious. We have to be cautious, but for example, the cases of abuse of a dominant position that affect the behavior of these markets, and they damage also the end consumers, because when there is a dominant position in the retail market, for example, competition authorities from the UK have documented this, and they have confirmed this, properly documented and with good underpinnings. They operate against caution. As a university professor and as a researcher, I agree with gathering the necessary evidence before acting. But in the meanwhile, there are entire markets, like in the case of the advertising market, the digital retail advertising market, that Google and Facebook domain. The media is impatient, complaining to the political authorities, and they want immediate answers. So we also have to deal with the tension that we see, because we have to know in depth new markets with new effects and the answers of players which existence has been compromised because of their dominant position that have been documented in markets, like in the digital retail markets. Once again, I would like to thank you for this invitation. This was an excellent opportunity.
Thank you again to both the panelists. It was a wonderful panel. I'm sure that all the audience learned a lot with the debate, and I myself would want this to continue for additional hours, but we don't have it. We have only a few more minutes, and I'll allow now our host, Hebert, to wrap up and close our panel. Thank you.
Obrigado. Obrigado, Olavo.
Thank you, Olavo, Professor Hovenkamp, Professor Becerra. I think we have had an excellent panel of discussion this morning. And we are going to continue in the afternoon at 2 p.m. We are going to continue discussing the power of platforms. And then with a talk by Dr. from the UK, and it's going to be mediated by Professor Mariana Valente from Internet Labs. Thank you all very much for your audience, for your participation, and we are very happy with all our activities here that are going to end now. And once again, thank you all very much. I wish you a very good afternoon.